Welcome along to the deep dive. Today, we're doing something, well, a bit like scientific archaeology, actually. We're going to be digging into the history, the background of evolutionary thought, the ideas that really set the stage for one of the biggest breakthroughs in science. And our guide here is the foundational work in Strickberger's Evolution. The goal, our mission, if you like, is to get a handle on not just what was discovered, but maybe more importantly, why it was so revolutionary at the time. Because the story really builds towards this incredible moment. You've got two naturalists, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, totally separate, thousands of miles apart. And they independently figure out the same fundamental theory of evolution. Their papers, they end up being presented together on the very same day, July 1st, 1858, at the Linnaean Society in London. Just amazing.
It really is an amazing confluence, that specific date. And it's the pivot point for our discussion today because, by the middle of the 19th century, the basic idea that species might change over time, well, that wasn't entirely new. It was gaining ground, largely thanks to the fossil record piling up. Evidence for deep time geological history. So the big challenge for scientists then wasn't really proving that change happened. It was figuring out how. What was the actual mechanism? And that's what Darwin and Wallace delivered. Natural selection. And here's the really important thing for you listening. Even with everything we know now about genetics, DNA, molecular biology, that core idea, natural selection acting on the variations you naturally find in populations, that is still the bedrock explanation for how evolution works.
Okay, so let's step back then. Before 1858, what did that intellectual landscape actually look like? You mentioned the idea of change was sort of bubbling up, but where did things start if we go way back?
Way, way back, you're looking at ancient Greece, and this concept called the Scala Naturae, the great chain of being, which basically saw life as fixed. Everything had its place in this static hierarchy, from the simplest forms right up to, humans at the top. No room for change there.
Right, a fixed ladder. That idea held sway for a very long time, didn't it?
For centuries, absolutely. But then, people started looking closer at the world. By the 18th century, you get thinkers like Georges-Louis Leclerc, the Comte de Buffon. And he actually did recognize selection, both natural selection and artificial selection, like in breeding.
He did. So hang on. If Buffon saw selection back then, why isn't he the one we talk about as the father of evolutionary theory? What was missing?
That's a great question. What was missing was the connection to creation of new species. Buffon saw selection, but he viewed it mostly as a destructive force, something that, caused species to go extinct. He didn't see it as the engine driving the formation of new species. For Buffon, new species arose through spontaneous generation, basically popping into existence based on the local environment.
Okay, so selection gets rid of things but doesn't build things, in his view. Which then brings us to Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, right? Early 1800s. He offered something much more systematic.
Yes, Lamarck's contribution was huge because it was the first really comprehensive materialistic theory of evolution. He proposed a mechanism for adaptation. It's famous, or maybe infamous now, the inheritance of acquired character.
Right, the giraffe stretching its neck and passing that longer neck directly to its kids.
Exactly. The idea that changes happening to an organism during its lifetime through use or disuse could be directly inherited by its offspring. And importantly, Lamarck had this, quite optimistic view. He didn't really believe in extinction in the same way. He thought organisms could always sort of adapt their way out of trouble. Imperfect species didn't just die out, they changed, they adapted.
So a very different picture, constant adaptation, no dead ends really, even though we now know that specific mechanism is wrong.
Precisely. The mechanism was incorrect, but he was thinking systematically about how change could happen over time. And what's really interesting is that even while Lamarck was proposing his ideas, others were starting to kind of separate out two key concepts. They were distinguishing between where variations come from in the first place and the forces that then act to preserve or eliminate those variations.
Ah, okay. So they were starting to glimpse the pieces of the natural selection puzzle, even if they didn't put it all together.
Exactly. They were sort of foreshadowing it. Using a principle of selection, maybe just within species, or for specific traits. Take William Charles Wells. He was a physician, Scottish-American, writing around 1813. He was looking at human populations, specifically skin color variations.
And he didn't just describe the differences, did he? He proposed a reason.
He did. He explicitly argued that selection was involved. He suggested that different human groups were differently adapted to local diseases, and that resistance, linked maybe to skin color or other traits, was being selected for. He even compared it to how breeders improve domestic animals. Though it's important to note he really only applied this idea to humans and certain traits, not universally.
But still connecting variation, environment, and survival.
Yeah.
Darwin later gave him credit for that, right?
Yes, Darwin acknowledged him in later editions of The Origin. He called Welles's work the first recognition of the principle. So the core idea was definitely out there, decades before Darwin and Wallace published.
Which leads us to, well, maybe one of the most fascinating footnotes in science history, Patrick Matthew.
Oh, Patrick Matthew, yes. The Scottish landowner.
The guy who later claimed he discovered natural selection and even put it on his business cards.
He did indeed. Discoverer of the principle of natural selection, quite the claim. And, he wasn't entirely wrong, in a way. He did write about it. Back in 1831, he described a natural process of selection acting in nature. He talked about how nature ensures the survival of the fittest, the best adapted reproductive beings. He even suggested this process could potentially lead to distinct species over long periods.
Okay, so if he wrote about it in 1831, why did Darwin and Wallace get the credit? Where was this published?
And here's the kicker. He buried this potentially world-changing idea in an appendix.
An appendix?
To a book about growing trees for shipbuilding, on naval timber and arboriculture.
You're kidding? Naval timber?
No kidding. It was completely obscure. Darwin had never seen it, never heard of it. When Matthew pointed it out years later after The Origin was published, Darwin was genuinely mortified and apologized for his entire ignorance of Matthew's work. It just goes to show, an idea needs the right context, the right audience to actually catch fire.
Absolutely. Timing and, well, perhaps a better choice of publication venue is everything. We should also probably mention Edward Blyth briefly.
Yes, Blyth is interesting too. He was a contemporary, a zoologist. He definitely wrote about variation and selection, but his take was different. He saw selection as a conservative force. He thought its main role was to weed out the extremes, the variants that deviated too much from the species' typical form, to maintain the status quo, basically.
So keeping species pure rather than changing them into new ones.
Exactly. Returning organisms to their archetype, not driving transformation. But Blyth does play a role in our main story because he was actually the one who later drew Darwin's attention to Wallace's writings. He helped connect the dots.
Okay, so we got this background. Ideas about change simmering, selection being glimpsed here and there. Now let's bring in the two key figures, Darwin and Wallace. Their backgrounds couldn't have been more different, could they?
Not at all. Complete contrast. Charles Darwin, born 1809, came from serious wealth, privilege. His father and grandfather were successful, wealthy physicians. He was set up to be a gentleman of leisure, really. He started studying medicine at Edinburgh, apparently hated the surgery. Can't blame him there.
I imagine surgery back then was pretty grim.
Oh, undoubtedly. So he switched to Cambridge with the idea of becoming a country clergyman. But his real passion was natural history, collecting beetles and whatnot. Apparently, he wasn't a stellar student. His father famously worried he'd be a disgrace to the family.
Bit harsh. But his family wealth meant he could pursue his interests, right?
Absolutely. That financial security was crucial. It allowed him the freedom to think, travel, and later, write.
Now compare that to Alfred Russel Wallace, born 1823.
A world away. Wallace's family was respectable middle class, but they fell on hard times. Poor. He actually had to leave school at 13 because they couldn't afford it anymore.
Wow, 13. So how did he get his education?
Largely self-taught. He read voraciously, attended public lectures at mechanics institutes, worked as a land surveyor with his brother. He had to constantly work to support himself and fund his passion for natural history, a totally different path. And he lived a long life, outlived Darwin by over 30 years, eventually receiving the Order of Merit in 1908.
Two incredibly different paths leading to the same monumental idea. And a huge part of their journey, literally, was travel. Exposure to the tropics seems to have been the catalyst for both of them.
Absolutely critical. Darwin's voyage on H.M.S. Beagle starting in 1831, that 5-year circumnavigation. And you have to picture this ship, the Beagle. It was tiny, about 27 meters long.
That's really small for a 5-year trip around the world.
Incredibly small. Darwin was the ship's naturalist, but also served as a sort of dining companion to the captain, Robert Fitzroy. He shared a cabin that was barely 3 by 3.5 meters, and it had the main mast going right through the middle. Extremely cramped.
But the science he did, groundbreaking. Collecting in Brazil, digging up those giant fossils in Argentina.
Yes, things like the giant ground sloth, Megatherium. Finding extinct creatures related to living ones, huge. And he experienced a massive earthquake in Chile. saw the land physically uplifted by several meters. That really hammered home the ideas of Charles Lyell's principles of geology, the idea that the Earth changes gradually over vast amounts of time, uniformitarianism.
Oh.
That gradual change was key to his later thinking about biological change, too.
Okay, so Darwin's voyage was formative. Wallace's expeditions. They sound even more dramatic, almost dangerous.
They really were. Wallace was directly inspired by reading Darwin's published journals from the Beagle voyage. He scraped together funds and went to the Amazon basin in Brazil in 1848 with another naturalist, Henry Walter Bates. But after 4 years of incredibly hard work collecting, disaster struck on his way home in 1852.
The ship sank.
Caught fire and sank in the middle of the Atlantic. Wallace survived, drifting in a lifeboat for 10 days. But he lost everything. His entire collection of specimens, all his notes, his diaries, years of work, just gone.
Oh, that's devastating. I think most people would have just given up after that.
It's almost unimaginable. But Wallace didn't give up. He was remarkably resilient. Just 2 years later, in 1854, he set off again. This time to the Malay Archipelago, modern-day Malaysia and Indonesia. And he spent 8 years there, until 1862.
8 years. What did he achieve there?
An astonishing amount. He traveled thousands of miles, often under incredibly difficult conditions. He collected something like 125,000 specimens, insects, birds, mammals,
Holy.
including, it's estimated, over 1,000 species that were completely new to Western science at the time. And his work there essentially founded the field of biogeography, the study of how species are distributed geographically. He identified the sharp boundary, now famously called Wallace's line, separating the faunas of Southeast Asia from those with Australian affinities, a fundamental observation.
So both men, through these intense, prolonged encounters with biodiversity in isolated places, were confronted with the same questions.
Exactly. Seeing these closely related but distinct species on different islands or on either side of a geographical barrier, it forced them to look for a mechanism. How did these patterns arise? It couldn't just be spontaneous generation, like Buffon thought, or Lamarck's inheritance of acquired habits. There had to be something else driving the transformation.
And for Darwin, the Galapagos Islands became a key piece of the puzzle, though maybe not instantly.
Right, the Galapagos, about 800 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador. During the Beagle voyage, he collected specimens there, tortoises, mockingbirds, finches. He noted that different islands, even though they seemed environmentally similar, often had their own unique species or varieties.
He saw the pattern, but didn't immediately grasp the full significance.
Not completely, no. The real aha moment, especially regarding the finches, came after he got back to England. He gave his bird specimens to an expert ornithologist, John Gould. And Gould was the one who told him, look, these birds you thought were different types, wrens, grosbeaks, they're actually all finches, a whole group of related species.
What?
And crucially, Gould confirmed that different combinations of these 12 or 13 finch species were found on specific islands, and their beak shapes were radically different, adapted for different foods.
That must have been the light bulb moment.
It seems to have been. Darwin famously wrote later, reflecting on the Galapagos observations, something like, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. He saw the divergence, the adaptation from a common ancestor. The big question remaining was how? What was the mechanism doing the modifying? And Darwin himself points to this in the very first paragraph of The Origin of Species. He says his observations in South America, the fossils, the distribution of species, and especially the Galapagos, seem to me to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries. He saw the connection. As he put it, the only cause of similarity in individuals we know of is relationship. Descent from a common ancestor.
So pulling it all together then, we've seen that evolutionary ideas weren't born in a vacuum. People were thinking about change, about fossils, even about selection in a limited way, like Wells and poor Patrick Matthew in his timber book.
Right. The thinking was definitely incremental. But Darwin and Wallace were the ones who independently crystallized the idea of natural selection as the primary engine, the main mechanism driving that change. And crucially, they provided the massive amount of evidence, the logical framework, and the global context needed to make the scientific world finally take notice in 1858.
It launched a revolution in biology.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, to think about Darwin's later life. After the Beagle voyage and publishing The Origin, he suffered from chronic illness. We don't know exactly what, but he spent the last 40 years of his life pretty much isolated at his home, Downhouse. He continued his work through immense correspondence, experiments in his garden, and writing, achieving this incredible depth of insight while quite physically cut off.
It shows what patient observation and deep reflection can achieve. But it's also worth remembering, isn't it, that his ability to do that reflection in isolation was supported by his wealth and status.
That's a really important point to make. His circumstances allowed him that space. Alfred Russel Wallace never had that luxury. He was constantly working, collecting, selling specimens, writing articles just to make ends meet and fund his research.
Yet they both got there. That simultaneous discovery in 1858, it's a testament, maybe, to the power of observation, curiosity, and asking the right questions, regardless of your starting point.
Well said. The mystery of mysteries, as Darwin called it, was unlocked through persistent inquiry into the natural world.
And that seems like a perfect place to wrap up this deep dive into the historical roots of evolutionary theory. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you found this look back as fascinating as we did. We'll catch you next time.